As some of you may know, I am the eldest of 5 children. One of the best things about being a kid in a family with many siblings is that if one were to, say, break a rule of the house, sneak into the snack drawer and eat a handful of cookies before dinner, there are myriad options for possible scapegoats. Occasionally, my parents would line us up in a row by age and question us all together to try to get the answer to who caught a frog in the creek behind the house and put it in the mailbox, theoretically, for example. One day, upon questioning us all to find out who the culprit was in the latest breach of family rules, my mother finally uncovered who did it. I can't exactly remember who it was that time. I'm sure it wasn't me. The guilty party wailed, "I'm sorry." I'll never forget my mother's response. She said, "You know, sometimes sorry just isn't enough." This week's gospel lesson is about saying you're sorry and being forgiven and not being forgiven. And it raises our Lenten question for the 4th week of Lent: can I forgive? You recall we've been walking through Lent together asking these questions that the gospel text pose to us. And they're hard questions designed to help us do the work of living a holy Lent, questions calling us to rigorous self-examination. Can I resist temptation? Can I give up my life? Can I admit I'm wrong? The passage from Luke's gospel today presents us with one of the longest and most beloved parables in all of Scripture. It's commonly known as the parable of the prodigal son. It's a familiar story to many of us, the subject of many, many pieces of beautiful and beloved art, and most notably, this is a paragraph that you and I can totally dismiss because it's so familiar. Today we have the challenge of looking again, one more time, carefully and with fresh eyes at Jesus' words as we ask ourselves this question this week: can I forgive? Recall, the Pharisees and the scribes, the super holy religious folk, were grumbling, the text says, because Jesus was behaving in a way that they found inappropriate. He was welcoming sinners and tax collectors and even sharing meals with them. In response to their criticism, Jesus, as he often did, decided to start telling stories. Right before our gospel lesson for this morning, Jesus starts his response to his critics by telling a story about a lost and found sheep, something that all the men in that pastoral and agrarian society could totally understand. A farmer has a flock of 100 sheep. One day he's counting and he notices that one is missing. So he leaves the 99 other sheep who are still there together, and he goes out looking for that one missing sheep. And when he finds the sheep that was lost, he celebrates. When Jesus told that story, I bet he looked around the crowd and he could see that people were engaged, nodding their heads, really understanding how a committed shepherd might leave his herd and go out into the wilderness to search for that one missing sheep and then celebrate when he finds it. And isn't it nice that God loves you and me enough to search for us when we get lost? But that's not what Jesus meant. And he could see they weren't getting it, so Jesus tried again. There was a woman who had 10 coins. One day she notices that one is lost, and so she turns her house upside down and inside out, looking in every nook and cranny until she finds that one missing coin. And you have to know that all of the women in the crowd, those who spent their days tending to homes and caring for families, they would know exactly what Jesus meant. And they would feel relief along with that woman that she had finally, after so much effort, found the coin. She rejoiced and she had a party, as God would do upon finding one of us. They all listened to Jesus' story and nodded appreciatively, and they got it. Hooray, God! But Jesus looked out at the crowd again, and he must have known somehow that they were holding the deep and personal challenge of this lesson far at arm's length. So he tried one more time. And this time, things got personal. Because it's one thing to talk about finding a lost sheep or searching for a misplaced coin. But it's another thing altogether to talk about people losing their way and what it means to find and to be found. Let's talk about human relationships, you might imagine Jesus said. Let's talk about the times that they get ugly and terrible, when someone hurts us and hurts us badly, when we need forgiveness, and when we offer forgiveness, and when we don't. Shall we? So Jesus tells a beautifully layered, richly embellished story of a father, a respectable father, not unlike those Pharisees and scribes who were standing there in the crowd. There was a father who had 2 sons. This was a good thing, the crowd nodded, since back in Jesus' day, it was imperative that you have at least 1 son to continue your bloodline. The oldest son is the most important, of course, but the second son is good too, like backup, insurance. As the story goes, one day the second son comes to the father and he says, "I'd like to have my inheritance early." Now, as you and I try to hear this parable again, we need to understand that back then, nothing passed from the ownership of the father to the son until after his death. So the son asking his father for a share of his inheritance was like him saying, "You are as good as dead to me." One commentator likened it to Prince Charles, who, upon being asked by the media about the possibility of ascending to the throne of England, replied, "Gentlemen, you are speaking of the death of my mother." In other words, the second son wasn't just asking for an advance on his allowance. He was basically saying, "I don't value my relationship with you, Dad." And to that father, the son's request must have felt like a punch in the gut. Everyone listening in the crowd that day felt it. But the outrage of the story continues, because after he's given a share of his family's assets, the younger son rushes off to seek his fortune in the big, wide world. Can't wait to get as far as he possibly can from his father and from everything his father represents. Gone. It was the ultimate betrayal. Lost sheep are one thing. Lost coins are another, but this hits a little too close to home. The people listening to Jesus would have been wrapped with horror, trying not to imagine anything like this ever happening to them. And I bet Jesus finally had their attention by that point in the story. This was the worst slap in the face you could think of. And the father's only recourse in that society in which they lived was to write that second son off as dead, to forget he ever existed. Well, you know what happens next in the story. The father strangely can't hold on to his anger. He's out on the road every single day, scanning the horizon for his lost son, the one who had done just about everything that a son could possibly do to hurt and betray his father, and who I think you and I can all agree did not deserve that kind of treatment from his dad. And one day, as he's out there scanning the horizon, the father sees the son who's coming back down the road through the dust because he doesn't have a choice. He doesn't have anything to eat. And the father, what does the father do? He picks up his robes and he runs down the road. His sandals are flapping, the dust is blowing all the way down to greet his son with open arms. He pulls him close and he hugs him tight and he puts a ring on his finger and he calls for refreshment. And he brings him into the house and he gives him new clothes and he throws a party, the biggest party that town had ever seen. That father had been waiting, just waiting to welcome that son home, forgiven. This would be such a great place to stop in the story. We could just stop right here and say, see, God forgives you and me like this. Right here, Jesus says, yes, God loves you so much that no matter how far you've gone away or how much you've hurt God or how little remorse you actually show in your desperation to return, God will take you back. But like the distracted or dense crowd that day, we are not listening very hard to Jesus if we think he's going to let us off that easy. We've got to keep reading. Because there's another character in this story who is also grievously wronged and who does not run down the road with excitement and who does not join the party. It's the older brother, the responsible one, the one who's left holding the bag of family obligations and carrying the mantle of his father's expectations all by himself. Not fair. For all these years I've been working like a slave for you, never once disobeying. He comes back, you throw a party. I stick around and do what I'm told. I get no appreciation whatsoever. And it's right here that you and I need to stop for just a minute and think about the fact that maybe this parable is not really a story about a wayward son who decides to come back home. Maybe this story isn't even about God forgiving us. Did you hear me? This is a story of two people who are horribly, terribly hurt, wronged, outrageously. One of them chooses to forgive, and one of them doesn't. Can you forgive? You'll notice in the text when the prodigal son returns home that the father doesn't make some big pronouncement about forgiving him. He doesn't say anything to him at all. He just embraces him and starts the party. The older son, though, he stays bitter, angry. He isolates himself, licking his wounds and tallying the fairness of it all. He probably didn't know my favorite quote from writer Anne Lamott. Not forgiving is like drinking rat poison and hoping the rat dies. Forgiveness isn't formulaic. It's not a magical pronouncement. It looks different in different situations. But fundamentally, listen to me here, fundamentally, forgiveness is the hard internal work of the one doing the forgiving. You don't need me to tell you that human relationships are messy things. There is not much about our interactions with each other that is unfailingly fair or loyal or loving or even kind. People let us down, even sometimes the people we trust the most. But our choice to forgive or not forgive the wrongs done to us doesn't really impact the people who have hurt us. It impacts us. If you and I need a reason to forgive, this is it right here. We forgive to be free. We forgive to be free. I spoke this week with Father Michael Lapsley. He's a close friend of this church and of many of us. Many of you know that Father Lapsley is a former South African anti-apartheid activist. In 1990, 3 months after the release of Nelson Mandela, the ruling de Klerk government sent Father Lapsley a parcel. In the parcel, there were 2 religious magazines, and inside one of them was a highly sophisticated bomb. When Father Lapsley opened the magazine, the explosion blew off both of his hands, destroyed one eye, and burned him severely. As I was thinking about what it takes to forgive this week, I got in touch with Father Lapsley to talk a little more deeply about his thoughts. He reminded me that the Greek word for forgiveness means something like to let go, to loosen, to release, to untie a knot. That Greek word is not found in Luke's text today, but its message certainly is, stated strongly and clearly by the one who, beaten and hanging on a cross, prayed, "Father, forgive them." Can you forgive? Sure would be nice for the person who hurt you if you could. But as my mother said, sometimes sorry is just not enough. Remember why Jesus was telling this story. He was confronted in that moment with self-righteous zealots, religious folk who pretended they were perfect by maintaining a slick facade and by dismissing everyone who didn't meet their standards. But guess what? Everybody needs forgiveness. Everybody needs forgiveness because everybody makes mistakes. It's when you and I close our hearts to forgiving others that we find so very painfully we are unable to forgive ourselves. Jesus looked around at the Pharisees and the scribes who wore their rules and their outrage like a fancy garment and who spent all their time grumbling and complaining and damaging relationships. Jesus wanted them to know, Jesus wants us to know, that it's the courage to forgive that makes your heart open to all the possibilities of life together. Not the clinging to rules and the dismissing of others. The refusal to forgive leaves you hard and fractured and alone. Maybe truer words have never been spoken. Forgiveness is hard. But who would you rather be? Open and loving or hard and closed? It's your choice. It's my choice. In a few moments, we'll enter into silence as this sermon comes to a close and think for a bit about this hard Lenten question that won't let us rest until we look inside and ask ourselves, can I forgive?